today, responding to a comment, and I believe the commenter's name is LARPing at Life. Let me see if I can pull it up. And LARPing at Life says, what is the functional difference between ethnic identity and racial identity? Would you consider yourself opposed to ethnocentrism? So, good question, LARPing at Life. We're going to investigate this question. So first of all, what is ethnicity? What does it mean to have an ethnicity? Ethnicity, first and foremost, is an identity. So we have kind of a circle here. ID, those are your identities. Within identities, you've got things like gender. You've got things like, what else do we have? We have religion, religious identity. We've got ethnicity. We've got maybe political identity. So we have all these different identities. We could list more if we wanted to. But these are the different identities that we have. Gender, if you're transgender, you're born that way. If you're gay, you're born that way. So no one taught you it. No one molested you and made you gay. You were born that way, so it must be, if it's not environmental, it must be genetic. So whether you're transgender, gay, whatever you are, your gender and we could say and sex or sexuality, that's all genetic. You don't choose that, you're born that way. No one makes you that way. You're whoever. I'm not going to get into that, but that's a genetic example of a genetic identity, something you're born with. Then we have religion. Now, religion's not something you're born with, but it is environmental. So your religion, it can come from your parents, it can come from the school. You can choose your religion, so there's an element of choice. But religious identity, often people get that from their parents, or they get it from dominant religious authorities. Maybe your parents were Christian, but you went to school and you learned about how the Bible was wrong, and so you've become an atheist. Ethnicity, is ethnicity genetic or is it environmental? Let's go to that. Let's skip that. Let's keep that last. Political. Is politics genetic? There is some research that shows that actually there is some kind of heritability of political opinion. But in general, we're going to say this is environmental. Same thing with religion. We could say religiosity has a genetic component. The only thing we can really say, gender and sexuality, is pretty purely genetic, at least according to the left. There are some right-wing extremists who say your gender and sexuality can be influenced by your environment, but we would give that as an example of sort of a purely genetic or purely inborn identity. Then things like religion and politics, they might have a genetic component to them. There might be genetic influencers there. I'm not going to reject that entirely, but there is at least some environmental component for both. We can all understand that. Ethnicity. Is ethnicity purely genetic? Is it purely environmental? Well, I would say ethnicity is really much more like religion or like politics than it is like sex or gender. Ethnicity, let's start to really dive into this concept of ethnicity. Let's give an example of some ethnicities. So an ethnicity might be something like Dutch. Had a few Dutch people interact with me. The Dutch ethnicity. Then you can have a German ethnicity. Then you could have an English ethnicity. And you could have a French ethnicity. Now, in terms of genetics, you could have Dutch people who are descended from Norse Vikings, Germans who are descended from Norse Vikings, English who are descended from Norse Vikings, and French who are descended from Norse Vikings. All of these people, in our theoretic model of genetic ancestry, that is, who were your ancestors, what population did they descend from, these guys could all be Norse. Individuals within each of these ethnicities could all be Norse. Yet do they ethnically all identify as Norse Vikings? No. So clearly there's an environmental aspect to this. Now, is there maybe some genetic correlation or some genetic aspect? Yeah, otherwise 23andMe wouldn't work. 23andMe couldn't accurately predict your ancestry if there was no genetic correlation here. But these are important things to think about. What else can we talk about in terms of ethnicity? So we've shown the way in which ethnicity, that you can have some kind of genetic population, we'll say something like Norse, and it sort of branches off into the German and into the Dutch and into the English and into the French. But there are other populations, right? So we could say in the French, you've also got some Mediterraneans. In the Dutch, we can break it down. Are you descended from Paleolithic hunter-gatherers or Neolithic farmers? Within the Germans, we can say there's a Norse influence, but there's also a Slavic influence genetically. We can say within the English, there's also a Celtic influence. So Norse, we can say this is like a genetic population. And there are some Norse people within this ethnicity of German, but there's also Slavic descended people. Within the Dutch, we can say there's clearly Norse, but there's also Germanic crossover, people who migrated north there. Inside the French, there's definitely Norse, but there's also Mediterranean influence. And within the English, there's Norse, but there's also Celtic influence. So if we're talking about genetic populations, haplogroups, whatever, we have to start talking about getting really specific with that. And then we're talking about Norse. And then when we talk about what does a person look like, do they have this long head like this? Or do they have this kind of short and stocky head like this? So those kinds of things. Within a family, you can have a brother who looks like this and another brother who looks like that. In the same way that you can have a brother with brown hair, and then the other brother has blonde hair. So each of these traits are genetic traits. When you ask, well, how can you have two brothers with two different colors of hair? That means within the gene pool of their parents, there were both dominant and recessive genes both for brown and blonde hair. Now, hair color is a polygenic trait, meaning that it's not bichromatic. It's not either you have pure blonde hair, pure brown hair, but that actually there's a variety of genes that influence your hair color and that combine in these sort of Punnett square ways. So when you have two brothers who have different physical features, different colors of hair, different shape of the skull, what that's referencing is that their ancestry is mixed. It's a genetically mixed, there's a genetic diversity in there. Whereas if you have a family where everyone pretty much looks the same, that shows that rather than having genetic diversity, you have pretty much genetic homogeneity. Within ethnicities, German, Dutch, French, English, you get people of different kinds. You have blonde hair and you have black hair in each of these categories. Now, blonde hair and black hair, that has to do with your genetics. That has to do with your ancestry, whether you have blonde hair, black hair, red hair, whatever. That's genetics. That's ancestry. The fact that you have multiple different genetic types, different profiles, and different phenotypes within each of these ethnicities proves that ethnicity is not purely genetic, that there's some dissonance between those two categories. That we might say that there's a thing called an ethnicity, and within that ethnicity are different genetic profiles and different genetic types. And so there's genetic diversity, and ultimately these types or these phenotypes ultimately go back to certain ancestral populations. We can look at the Yamnaya, we can look at the Neolithic farmers, we can look at the sort of pre-Indo-European hunter-gatherers of Europe. So we've got all these different populations, and then they show up to certain degrees in these different ethnicities. So ethnicity is really a socio-linguistic concept. And it has mostly to do with language. So within Germany, for example, we've got Berlinisch. Berlinisch would be the dialect that is spoken in Berlin. In America, this would be like the Chicago accent. He's from Chicago. Or the Boston accent. He's from Boston. Or whatever kind of accents, maybe a Detroit. I don't know. What do you say for a Detroit accent? Is it like the Chicago accent? I don't really know. But anyway, you have these sort of city-states within America that form their own dialects. And so people can say, that's not the way we do things in Chicago, or that's not the way we do things in Detroit. We don't talk like that. We have our own slang. These big cities of America, they've got their own slang. They've got their own dialect. Berlinisch, it's a specific dialect of German. Now, it's related to other dialects in Germany, broader regional dialects. So Berlinisch is like Plattdeutsch. So this is Northern German as opposed to Hochdeutsch, which is really the southern point. Now, why is Hochdeutsch, why is it reversed? Niederdeutsch, Hochdeutsch. Why is Hochdeutsch to the south? That would be High German. Why is it in the south? Well, because it's closer to Rome. That's the origin of the term Hoch, meaning higher, closer to Rome. Nieder, farther from Rome. Now, you could also say that there's more mountains in southern Germany. Whatever the etymology is doesn't really matter. But this Berlin dialect is part of a larger regional dialect of northern German dialects. In the same way we could say Chicago and Detroit accents, maybe they're part of a Midwestern dialect. And maybe the Boston, that's sort of the New England dialect. So what we're kind of seeing here is that ethnic identity as a sociolinguistic identity can be reduced to city-states. But within city-states, you get diversity. And this messes everybody up. Everyone gets confused because you say, well, you could have an Italian accent, you could have an Irish accent, you could have a Yiddish accent. We could have all kinds of accents, right? Within the same city. And so geographically, this messes everybody up because people want these nice concentric circles. They want to say, first of all, you speak English, and English is a part of the Germanic language families. Okay, and then below English, you've got the American accent, and then within American, you've got the Midwestern accent, and then within the Midwestern, you've got the Chicago accent, right? So everyone wants these neat concentric circles that they can put on a map. But in reality, the Germanic languages technically contain English, but English is also a Romance language. So much, and it's also a Greek language. So much of our vocabulary is inherited from Greek and Roman, from French. So English is partially a Romance language. And the basic words of English are all Germanic, like to and from and go and high and low, and these sort of really basic children's words are all Germanic. But the sophisticated, scientific, exact, parsimonious, just throwing out fancy words, all the fancy words of English are basically Romance, because the Normans spoke French and the common people spoke Anglo-Saxon. So English is a Creole language. It's a mixed up language. It doesn't fit 100% into these bigger categories. It's got substratum and superstratum. Then American English, well, is it entirely of English? Or is there also some influence of some other languages in there? Well, there are clearly American English terms that we use, some words that we use, that are from other languages. Yiddish has come in, German has come in. Things like when you say Gesundheit, there's other examples, tchotchkes, or, you can, some people use Yiddish more than others, but all of them have kind of permeated into the American dialect such that it's not a purely English dialect. It's not 100% pure. And then you've got like this Midwestern accent. But is the Chicago accent purely of the Midwest? Well, who are the Midwestern people? Majority German descent. But Chicago accent, you've got the influence of the Italians and the Irish. And probably some Yiddish or whatever. And so maybe this Chicago accent is kind of like a little blip in a wider Midwestern that actually is more related to these Irish, Italian, Yiddish accents than the surrounding geographical population. So this is a huge thing that messes people up when it comes to ethnicity, is they think it's kind of like these Russian dolls, these concentric circles that we can plot on a map, on a graph, and say everything fits in concentrically together, when that's not the case. And even when we investigate populations, things break down in ways that are not purely concentric, that do not purely encapsulate one another in this very sensible hierarchy. Sort of an ancestry tree. If you've got the Germanics, and then you've got like the Dutch and the English, and then the English go off into the Australians and the Americans and the Canadians, and the Dutch goes off into South Africa and the Netherlands. Well, this is more confusing than you'd think, because these South Africans also go up to the Portuguese, and the English, the Americans, don't just come from the English, but they also come from the Dutch, and they also come from the Germanics. Now, a lot of what people want to say when I show them some kind of family tree like this, how it's all mixed up and messed together, it's not the pure arborescent tree model that people would like to see. What people say is, oh, this is just America. This is just America. This is just the way America is. Before this, you had these perfect European states of Germany and France and Italy and the Slavic countries and Great Britain and Scandinavia. You had all these different spheres, and they're perfectly separate from one another and whatnot, but that's not even true. Sorry for the alarm. I'm going to have to go in 5 minutes. Let's wrap this up. In Germany and France, what happened in here between Germany and France? You had a guy called Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was a Frank. He was of this Germanic tribe. And Charlemagne had sons. And these sons founded the kingdoms of France and the kingdom of Germany and the kingdom of Italy. And they went around Europe having sons and having daughters and marrying them into different royal families. So the royal family of Poland and the royal families of Scandinavia and the royal families of the British all came to have these descendants of Charlemagne. And so in a sense, the rulers of Europe were all German, Frankish people descended from Charlemagne in one way or the other. Now, maybe there's some exceptions to this, and maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but when you look at the Romanovs in Russia, were they ethnically Russian? No, they were not ethnically Russian. They were ethnically Dutch and English and German and so on. In Italy, when you look at the different names of the Italians, they're often Romanized or Italianized forms of German names in terms of a lot of the noble families and noble dynasties, because Rome was taken over by Germans after the collapse of the empire. In France, all the kings and the emperors and so on, they're descended either from Normans from Scandinavia or from these Charlemanic Germans. In Britain, you've got the Normans ruling over once again. So they're not native Celts or whatever. So the native peoples are never ruled over in some pure sense by their ethnic brethren. That the aristocracy of Europe was not ethnically the same as the masses of people. And the masses of people themselves, you had gypsies in there. I've got to write out the whole thing. Or no, I should write Roma. That's the politically correct term. You had the Roma, you had Jews, you had in Sicily, you had Arabs in Sicily. And these people got around. And they reproduced themselves, and they got all kinds of genetic influence among the masses. You also had Mongols coming in. You had a people called the Alans. You had, of course, the Magyars. You had the Bulgars, which we think today of Bulgaria, but the Bulgars are not an Indo-European people. They speak an Asiatic language. So all of these people influence the masses. So there is not the concept of ethnic purity here doesn't work. Now, does that mean we throw the concept of ethnicity out the window? Well, even if we admit that ethnicity is a social construct, it can still be a valid category and a useful category in the same way that political identity is a useful identity, or religious identity is a useful category. Ethnicity is also useful. I'm not going to throw it out the window. I'm not going to say that it's useless. Just because I've shown the way in which is not perfectly genetic or whatever doesn't mean that it doesn't have any basis or any reality or any usefulness, even if it is a pure social construct, which of course I think there is a genetic component. But that doesn't make it useless. But this is, when we speak of ethnic identity, we're talking about something that's influenced by your ancestry. So if you have two parents who are Dutch, you're ethnically Dutch. What if you have one parent who is white and one parent who is black? What are you? Well, in the case of Barack Obama, he ethnically identified as black. You could say this has something to do with the one-drop rule historically in America. You could also say it has to do with the genes controlling for skin color, that the more melanin-rich genes happen to predominate genetically. They're more dominant, whereas the lighter genes for lighter skin are recessive or whatever. Whatever explanation you want to come up with, we can get these ethnic mixes of people, and then they're either forced to identify with one of the sides of their heritage, or you get these things called historical category coloreds in South Africa and also mulatto. And you get what's called ethnogenesis from the combination of different ethnicities. You could say that the Finnish people, the Finns speak a non-Indo-European language, and yet clearly they have a lot of Scandinavian DNA. They have an ethnicity that's composed of two different origins, two different sources, and probably more than that. But the Finns now are a cohesive identity and an ethnicity. So this whole process, just because it's complicated doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. Ethnicity, of course, does matter. But ethnicity is a fluid thing. Ethnicity changes over time. Ethnicity is not eternal. The Germans have not existed for, more than 6,000 years at the most. Human history is very long. So the idea that putting stock in your ethnicity is something eternal, something high, something truthful. Ethnic identity can change over the course of generations, hundreds or thousands of years. I said hundreds or thousands, not hundreds of thousands. So again, when we talk about, say, the Indo-Europeans, they're about 6,000 years old. When we talk about some of these branches, when the Indo-Europeans branch off into the Slavic and into the Germanic, that happens maybe 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So then when we start to talk about the Germans as opposed to the Dutch and the English, or something like that, that maybe happens 2,000 years ago when the Anglo-Saxons go to England and all these places. During this time, by the way, if you actually read the works of Tacitus, the Germans are not politically unified. So ethno-nationalism is not the Germanic ideal. They lived in tribal societies, which occasionally would unite for various political reasons, or reasons of war against the Romans or the Huns. But the natural political order, the natural political organization of the Germanic people was not to define friend and enemy on the basis of whether you're German or Germanic. It was on the basis of tribal affiliation, honor, loyalty among these different family lines and bloodlines. So Germanic peoples, or Germans, have really only existed for 2,000 years. What's happening with technology is that this splitting, or the emergence of different identities, Indo-European, Germanic, German, that you see first, there's a sort of 3,000-year gap and then a 2,000-year gap. What technology is doing is technology is really changing the way that ethnicities are interacting and multiplying with each other. Now, is this going to result in egalitarianism? Is this going to result in a future where everybody is all the same? No, because we've seen mixing before, ethnic mixing, and that results pretty much in something like a caste system. In India, you've got the Brahmin at the top. You've got the Kshatriya. Hope I'm spelling this right. Kshatriya in the middle. Then you have the Vaishya down here. And then below them, you have the Shudra, who are just the workers. And then below them, you have the Dalit. The Dalit are not actually the majority of Indian society. So this is sort of a pyramid with a small bottom. You could say in Sparta, these people would be called helots, slave class. Shudra being the worker class, Vaishya being the merchant class, and so on and so forth. These are ethnic categories. These are identities that are related to ancestry. That's what ethnicity is. So this is the multiracial society of ancient India that continues to the present day, although people have tried to stamp it out. It still exists. People still identify in this way, and it still has an impact on Indian society. This is what we're moving toward in the West because of mass immigration, the multiplicity of ethnicities. This is what we're going to get. So, race, to what extent does race exist? I mean, to what extent is it a social construct? Is it founded in genetics? That's pretty controversial, but it's pretty clear that race doesn't equal ethnicity. So you can be white and have many different potential ethnicities, whereas your ethnicity is what it is. There's no, you could say within the category white, we've got Germans and Italians and English and French, all within this white category. Now, originally, India, we say Indian is an ethnicity now, but we've got the Brahmin, and we have the Vaishya, and we've got the Kshatriya, and we've got the Dalit. We've got all these people within India. These people have separate origins. Some of these people are Dravidian in origin. Some of these people are Indo-European in origin. It's all mixed together now. And there's even, you could say there's an Australoid component to the Indian population. So there's multiple, you could say, if we're going to use this term, I don't really want to use the term racial because it's too controversial, but if we say there's different populations that mix together to create different ethnic categories within what in America is called Indian American, yeah, that's your ethnicity. So there's a huge complication going on here where now there is all this multi-ethnic, multi-population immigration into the West, and all these categories are going to become Indianized. And you're going to still have ethnicity, but it's going to be more broken up into this caste system is the future. Am I opposed to ethnocentrism? Well, ethnocentrism is going to exist whether I want it to or not. So it's not my choice to abolish it. Ultimately, when we look at the animal world or early political formation, people are always tribalistic. Animals are tribalistic. There's no way to really eliminate the idea of people organizing around an identity based off ancestry. There's no way to prevent that. Everyone's going to do it. Even the people who are they claim to be anti-ethnocentric are often still ethnocentric. So I don't think there's a way to eliminate ethnocentrism, but that said, I don't think ethnocentrism is a stable foundation or a base of political theory for these reasons. Let's see if we can speed through the chat. Busting out the whiteboard, your sound is kind of low. Yeah, I apologize about that. You're just gonna have to turn up the volume, but I guess the sound wasn't on point today because I'm kind of far away from the camera, right? See if I can fix that. Well, I don't know. I don't know what's going on here. The whiteboard kind of messed me up. I wanted to use the whiteboard, and it sort of... Usually I maintain a certain distance to the camera. Who is the guy that Ken is challenging to debate everybody? I have a trans brother. Female to male. Ethnicity is genetic. Well, we've explained that in this video, why that's not true. Ethnicity has always been genetic to me. Okay, well, we're blah, blah, blah. Michael asking the real question. Not all ethnic groups are religious in an Abrahamic sense. I didn't make that claim. What is the modern national ethnicities? Although I would claim that everyone is religious in a general sense, but, not in an Abrahamic sense. What is the modern national ethnicities? These are nationalities. Okay, well, nationality, the concept of nationalism comes out of ethnicity. So, I mean, you can speak of nations without having countries associated with them. What's the semantic difference between nationality and ethnicity? I think we might be getting overcomplicating the issue. I agree, ethnicity is a mix of culture, language, but ancestral purity sometimes go along with ethnic myths. That can be true. Also, modern national ethnicities are basically inventions of enlightenment, deconstructing your ethnicity. I got my 23andMe right here. Environmental or cultural. Your cool mug. No ethnicity. If we take the English, then there's obvious differences within England itself. English people are largely pre-Celtic, pre-Germanic. We're descended from people who lived here thousands and thousands of years ago. We're British. I want more effective ways to stereotype people. You can have okay, I can't read that. Tribalism, but still everyone living in England has more in common than anyone living in Germany. That's not true. So there are plenty of people in England who are much more genetically associated with the average German than they are with the average English person. Bar individual thought differences and differences. You could say if you're talking about political beliefs or whatever, I don't know. I don't know what you want to say. That they obviously, people who grow up speaking English grow up speaking the English language, so that's a linguistic, tautology there. That is a difference. But then we're talking about language. We're not talking about genetics. See, West Europeans are quite closely related, but it's about lineage, deconstructing the parts at the expense of the whole. I don't find this kind of deconstruction compelling. Closer to Rome, I thought it was called high because of the mountains. Yeah, that's what people typically believe. But Niederdeutsch and Hochdeutsch, I believe, has to do with your distance to Rome, whereas Low German belongs to the lower, flatter regions. Dutch is a Low German because lowlands. Yeah, that's what people think. But I don't believe that's true. I believe it has to do with the closeness to Rome, the etymology, but it doesn't really matter. Even within the Japanese, it's a diverse subgrouping of people. Okinawans are Japanese, but not the same ancestrally as ancestral Yayoi. It's more like those distribution charts of Twitter networks with concentrations and crossover and complications. Probably not all, but I wonder if accents are influenced by geography and climate. Does not negate the fact that your average German is much more similar to the average French than the average American, than your average Asian, than your average African. Well, that's a complicated sentence. What do you mean by similarity? Do you mean similarity of political beliefs, similarity of spoken language, similarity of religion? What do you mean when you say similarity? Similarity of all those things? What happens when Asians and Africans come into America? What happens then? I mean, so we can talk about populations and we can look at different things, then we can look at aggregates and say, yeah, we can talk about geography and the relation of different opinions or behaviors or phenotypes or whatever geographically. But I'm talking specifically about ethnicity here. And I guess there is some confusion about geography and ethnicity and all these different things. I feel like the conclusion to all these presentations, we shouldn't feel kinship with our fellow X because look how complicated it is. Well, what I'm saying is that historically, ethnocentrism and ethno-nationalism have always had an influence in the way that human beings organize with each other, but that it's never been the sole or foundational aspect of any political organization for most of history. Now, there was a brief period after 1848 when a bunch of Marxist liberals, atheists, anarchists said, we should have democracy and it should be based on ethnic sovereignty and ethnic self-determination. So that's when this concept of ethno-nationalism really became an ideology with any sort of power. And it was that way for a while. And then after, 1965, at least in America, that concept has been on the decline. And so we're returning to the historical norm, which is that ethnicity is not really, you don't have these ethnically homogeneous states. And that's kind of the way that history has been for a very long time. You can point to, say, Athens and say, oh, well, Athens, they were all Athenians. Well, yes, the voting population was Athenians, but demographically you had people from all over. Sparta, it was even more stark with the fact that you had Spartans and Helots. So the idea of ethnically pure states is an aberration of history. And we're returning to a historical norm when people say, oh, this has never been done before. Mass immigration has never been done before. People have been mass migrating across the world for all of human history. The Indo-Europeans were mass migrants, immigrants, invaders, conquerors. So that's what's happening today. The only difference is it's being done instrumentally as a high, low versus the middle tactic against, you know, the. I got to be careful with my language, but it's being done against the middle. And who does the mainstream identify as the middle? Well, they identify certain people as the middle, and so that's how it's being used instrumentally. But in a broader sense, it's not an aberration. It's just the way that it's being done is very much, taking groups which are not in the middle class and bringing them into countries to benefit the upper class. Your average Swede is more in common with the average Congolese than the average human with the average deer. Okay. Of course, things aren't purely concentric. That's not the point of nationalism or the nation state. My argument is that their nation states are an aberration of history, and that for most of history, the people who ruled over you were a separate ethnicity from you. They had a different identity, a different bloodline, a different ancestry. So the idea that our elites should be of the same ethnicity as us is an aberration of history. Now, maybe if you go back to Paleolithic times, you're going to get back to a point where that is. But as far as post-agricultural, civilized cities, urban centers, I think that's the case. The average human has much more in common with the average deer. The exceptional human has much in common with the exceptional deer, too. Yeah, the spirit of the exceptional deer. Strawmanning nationalists again. No, nationalists say that people should be ruled over people who look like them, or people of the same ancestry, the same identity, or whatever. And I don't think that's historical, and I think that's like a very arbitrary political foundation. Nationalism is means for the state capitalism to break down obstacle localism. Contradicting himself, he says Romanovs weren't Russian, but according to him, blood doesn't matter. I didn't say blood doesn't matter. I said there's not a one-to-one correlation between your spoken language and your ethnicity, or between your ancestry and your ethnicity. The Romanovs did not identify as ethnically Russian. They identified fundamentally as part of the aristocratic class of Europe, which is why you got the Willie Nicky telegrams where they're like, oh dear cousin. The European aristocracy regarded each other as family and as a common ethnic group, as a common identity group. And you could say in some way the Romanovs tried to Russianize themselves, or to integrate into Russia, assimilate into Russian culture. But there's always a distinction there. I mean, the Russian aristocracy spoke French largely for a significant period after the Napoleonic Wars. So the idea, I didn't say that ethnicity is determined by language. I said there's not some simple concentric thing. We can say ethnicity is purely genetic or ethnicity is purely linguistic. But there are all these different identities, a complicated thing. So saying that, oh, we have this neat little category called ethnic identity, and we're going to have that be the foundation of the state, that's not a solid or firm foundation. States are always multi-ethnic. And people like the Romanovs, for instance, they could identify simultaneously both as Russian in a linguistic sense or political sense, political Russian, but then they could also identify as European aristocrats descended from the Dutch and the Germans and Charlemagne and all that sort of thing. None of this matters. That's the ultimate point, which is wrong. Ethnicity clearly does matter. But the idea that it is a heuristic on which to found the state, I think, is arbitrary and ahistorical. I'm part of the Allen tribe. Charlemagne was God. You can console yourself with that. Ken is talking from an American standpoint. He doesn't know the intricacies between nations, regions, and cities. I mean, I don't know. I just talked about Berlin as a city. You've got Bavaria as a region within Germany that is sort of a sub-ethnic category, Germany being a nation, there's a German ethnicity, and then you have a larger Germanic family, and then you have, Europe as a whole. So I don't know that that you can really claim I'm ignorant about that. If so, maybe point out exactly what you think I'm ignorant about. But I mean, yeah, the idea that this is an American standpoint, I'm looking at a broader historical standpoint that goes back quite a long time. I'm saying that your ethno-nationalism existed for like 100 years out of thousands and thousands of years of multi-ethnic um, states, and that doesn't mean that ethnicity isn't important. It just means that ethno-nationalism is not um, it's not well historically grounded. Elites leveraging masses through mythology, and what is the current one? Um, Penny's point is no point. He made an argument speaking to imaginary dumb audience using his little whiteboard. Then he finishes up by saying he thinks ethnicity is still important. Why do you make this video? I made it in response to a specific comment that said, what's the difference between ethnic and racial identity, which I tried to explain. If we assume by racial we mean ancestral populations, then I tried to delineate the difference between the two, and they said, would you consider yourself opposed to ethnocentrism? And my argument is, ethnocentrism exists whether I want it to or not. It's something we have to deal with. It's not something we're ever going to eliminate, but at the same time, it shouldn't be the foundation of the state because that's not historically well grounded. That's the point of what I'm saying. Yeah, ethnicity is important in the same way gender is important, but I don't think that we should have states exclusively composed of men and women. I think you should have both men and women in the state, and you shouldn't try to create a homogeneous state of only men or only women. That's something that science fiction authors think about, but it's not historically well grounded. Maybe with transhumanism or something, you're going to achieve those sort of crazy outcomes, but it's not really something to be advocating for in the current year. Rich versus melanin deficient. Vegan debate, if you count ethnicity as important, it's a factor that must be considered. Yeah, we can consider it. It just can't be the sole heuristic on which we found the concept of citizenship and statehood. Half black people look half black. Americans are confused on this question because virtually all African Americans are mixed race and occupy the same label. African Americans about 25% European in ancestry, and there are people in America. There are people who are 90% African, and they do look a bit different from people like Obama, who are 50% African, and people who are like 25% black. You look at different people like what do you say, Du Bois. You look at people like Frederick Douglass, and these people are counted as black. Are they truly black? That's a different question. But clearly, there's an ethnic identity there of the Black American that is genetically convoluted, but it still is sort of an ethno-political identity. I love my pure. Okay, I'm not going to read that. I think every ethnicity tried to protect it from outsiders, only failed when getting overrun. Today is a different beast. Friend-enemy distinction is determined by scale. The Vikings were invited into Russia, which is a myth. We don't actually know if that's true or not. I mean, the Vikings came to power, and then they created a myth that said, oh, we were invited here. Okay, all right. Well, of course they would say that. Just like the Americans were invited into Normandy, right? So the conqueror always creates some kind of myth that justifies himself. I think even the Indo-Europeans in the Vedas say that, we were invited into India. There was so much chaos. I mean, it's always the same Indo-European propaganda. I'm not hating. I'm just saying that's kind of how history works. Ethnicities and cultures are not splintering, but did the Swedish Vikings take over the Russian ethnicities? That's why certain people run the U.S. financial markets. One thing is to rule over land, another to actually take it by replacement. We will resort to more basic forms of identification. We're going back to superstitious Indian belief systems. Really are not moving toward that system because the Indian subcontinent was doing all this development in its own relative bubble. Well, I would say that we have a global bubble now. So I think that's my projection. I still believe that. I agree there will be certain ethnic groups filling certain rules. 100% Indians are basically Australoid. I don't know what you mean by the term 100% Indian. I think Brahmins are 100% Indian, but clearly there is a pre-Dravidian population. Dravidians, by the way, are pre-Indo-European people who come from Iran, ancient Iran. So Dravidians and Indo-Europeans are not indigenous. I mean, no one's indigenous to anywhere, but there were people who were living in India prior to the Dravidians and prior to the Indo-Europeans, and those people were likely Australoid. The mixed masses of the future will orient themselves according to personal loyalties. See Latin America. That's why I have a hard time believing the Indo-European thing, because Aboriginals have blonde hair, large brow ridges, etc. That is commonly referred to as Caucasoid. Well, Australian Aboriginals are not Caucasoid. They do not share, and they're not part of that classification, that population classification. Let's become European Brahmin as a minoritarian strategy. You can do that. No one is going to stop you from doing that. Of course, can't advocate that, but yeah. European descended people are largely disinterested in ethnocentrism. True. We should send Kenneth to the Congo to save the people there. He will thrive with intellect and honor just for a year. It's the Amish test. The Amish don't do that, and I don't want to do that. So I don't know what the straw man is there, because I don't think ethnic identity should be the pure heuristic on which we found our political ideology. Therefore, I want to go save the people of the Congo. That doesn't follow. Ethnic identity is subordinate to Sweet Baby Ray's identity. Migrants exist. What a revelation. Can you put new wine in old wineskins? Sweet Baby Ray. God, this bacon is so good. The Master Rays. That's Rays. Yeah, the sun's rays. Similarity of everything that is important, genetic potential. We're not moving back to the Indian caste system. Oh, we are. This is Hangus, by the way. This is the guy who says, I'm not going to waste my time coming on your channel. And then he continues to post in my Discord and watch my videos and listen to what I have to say and post comments in my chat. But he's too afraid to come on the channel and have a debate. So I don't know. Maybe he has a speech impediment. I don't know. I feel bad for the guy. We're not moving back to the Indian caste system, nor is it desirable, seeing as it kept India backwards for so long. Industrial society is different. Ethnic demands will become more real. Drop a like, says King Burrito 777. Apparently, Mr. Coolmug gets really mad when we say that. Mr. Coolmug, he only likes to obsessively comment. He doesn't want the channel to be popular, because he wants to be the only commenter. He wants to scare everyone else away so that he can just be 100% Mr. Coolmug time. Even, and I would have kept the Mr. Coolmug podcast, but he wasn't consistent. Sometimes he'll come in and make 100 comments, and then he'll be totally dry, and then he'll come back. So you can't rely on the guy. He's like a volcano. Even as an implicit something, Ken isn't wrong about pointing that most of history was not based upon this Enlightenment nationalism. I wanna check out King Burrito, but I can't do that unless I go to the thing. Maybe my view is not ethno-nationalist, but really I would like people like myself to thrive into the future. So I would like those most genetically similarly to me to survive or thrive the most. Okay, well, the way to do that, I would suggest to, is not through majoritarian strategies, through a minoritarian strategy. Kenneth, have you started to develop a minoritarian strategy? I mean, I've talked about it a lot, so I would call that development. If you have specific questions, I mean, ask me specific questions. If you don't ask me specific questions, then, I mean, it's like, what's the strategy? Well, I mean, you just realize that, you realize what these things are and you act accordingly in the most general sense. Like, if you want to ask a specific question, ask one. But I've defined what minoritarianism is in terms of hypermodernity. Let's see if I can jump into the chat here and get to Mr. 777. Because stupid. I just like to, whenever I see a new person in the comments, I always like to go check out their channel. He's a Fortnite and Minecraft channel. That's kind of cool. All right. Descending scale of caring as we move genetically away from people like myself. Mass immigration is fast, massive, and destructive force against Europe. It's a high-low versus the middle tactic. I would like to have some sweet baby raised. Don't omit that fact. Don't twist the truth. He doesn't really care, to be honest. My sweet Europe. Europe needs to take in Africans, namely, it should help the Dutch South Africans. You deconstruct everything but provide us with nothing. I'm just saying that you should not be an ideological ethno-nationalist. Now, what I've put forth is I've said that something real, you should do something reasonable. You should be interested in class, and you should start looking at that as a vector of power. If you care about your descendants, if you care about what the future people of the earth are going to look like or be descended from, you have to gain power, and so you have to deal with the class system and not burying your head in the sand of ethno-nationalism. So that's what I'm advocating for. Ancestral closeness is probably more accurate than ethnicity. Nietzsche identified as a Pole. He was also a pan-European. Inter-European ethnic difference in rulers versus plebs is less of a jump than, let's say, Semitic peoples as rulers versus European plebs, in my opinion. I don't think so. I don't think that's true. I think that these are separate populations. I think that Jews are. I mean, if we look into terms of ancestral populations, there's different ways of looking at it. There's different ways of measuring it. But I mean, if you believe in the concept that you could take a population, you could breed them to be different from different populations. Like, when you look at the development of the Jewish people, basically the Jewish people are who they are today, really because of less than 2,000 years of selection. Like, the Jewish people that we know today are not the same Jewish people that existed 2,000 years ago, and they developed to how they are today, I would say really mostly over 1,500 years of selection, you know, continuing to the present day. But that selective process happened over, you know, tens of hundreds of years, a couple thousand years. I think you've had a similar amount and similar time and similar distance between this pan-European elite and the people who they rule over. Now, over time, replacement of the mass population by this elite through the elite having large families and the masses having small families, and primogeniture as a concept has actually led to the dissemination of this tribe, the ruling caste tribe, down into the people, which I would say is also what happened to India with the Dravidians and Indo-Europeans, if we assume that India was originally full of Australian Aboriginals, essentially. That's how they came to be who they are today. But, you know, that's a little contentious, the history of prehistoric India. Of course, ethnicity is not purely about blood. This is another straw man against nationalists. No, it's not, because plenty of nationalists say ethnicity is your blood. I mean, we're just like quoting here from ethno-nationalist memes. This is not a straw man. Ethno-nationalists do not have a nuanced take. If they had a nuanced take, they wouldn't be radical ideological ethno-nationalists. Intelligent nationalists, not the wife beaters you constantly refer to. I haven't really referred to anybody as a wife beater. I haven't brought that up. I have brought up political extremists who seem to get in all sorts of trouble for different reasons, but that's a different topic. There's no point trying to brush off nationality by appealing to ancients. Before the industrial era, when most people lived among local customs, the language of the state and even the leader mattered less. So you're saying language didn't matter, but nationality did matter? That seems to be a self-defeating argument. Well, you had Europeans ruling Semites historically, so why not the reverse? Intelligent nationalists, where are they at? I am Europeans. You don't rule anything. I prefer for Europeans. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, not going to read that. Book club, why do you private your music? Ken, you've got to do some deconstruction of ethnicity. I think the deconstruction of nation states is the immediate problem. What is this onion man babbling about? You can only defend an ethnic group if you have a state. That's not true. That's just not true. Jewish people haven't had a state for 2,000 years, bro. We do have to act against supranational institutions. just don't understand the history of the Jewish people. These statements of her, Ken is American, he doesn't understand my history. Interesting nuances, something to ponder about. Brits were invited to rule India by shitty princes. I mean, yeah, that narrative is pretty common. Yeah, we were invited here, by the way. I mean, that's what everyone says. We were just invited. But maybe it's true in some cases, but I'm not sure. It sounds like propaganda. Slavic people invented the superior, strong, handsome. I don't know about that. Ethnic identity seems to be something people default to. Watching the stream. Need some olive oil in my ear. Ah, that's a good one. Cut to the chase. Chatsy therapy is lame, not very cool. Everybody's got a speech impediment. Chapsy won't debate. Chatsy is depressed. Chatsy is a Brit bong. There's a sense of daring to the neo-Machiavellianism that I'm bringing to the table. Europeans are not inclined toward ethnic identity because they've been systematically gaslit through every vector of propaganda education since the end of the Second World War. Well, ethnic identity was really created by ethno-nationalists through Enlightenment thinking, which didn't exist before that. Medieval Germans did not think of themselves as we're Germans. They thought of themselves as we're Bavarians, we're Catholics, we live in Berlin. So ethnic identity, national identity among the masses was never some strong motivating factor because they didn't really have any influence or say. But yeah, I wish I had more time for this. But maybe we can just do another video on this. Will you come live on our Big Bird plantation? I'll come visit you. I've tried to contact your people on Discord. I'll come visit you. If you want to come host me in your plantation, I will come visit you, Big Birds. I've messaged 2 of your people and you haven't responded, so I don't know what's going on with you guys. But let me know. Get me on Discord. I think you're in the Discord, Admiral. So let's chat. If you want me to visit, I'll make some time and effort to come visit you. After a generation or two of Europeans having the ability to mix with whoever, Europeans left out will be ethnically insular. Possible. The group who don't care can join the beige. Mixing doesn't happen that fast. It's a long game. Look at the states who want to build a community like Arvel, but already have the resources, so we're helping him out. Cool. Any should statement is ideological. True. You've been saying not to be an ideological ethno-nationalist for years. Yeah, and people still don't get the picture, so I'm still going to push it until every single one of you either leaves the channel or you agree with me, so I'm never going to stop. 10% mixing per generation adds up fast, no more than 200 years. I'll bury my head in Europe as sand. The more incentive availability, removal of taboos associated with mixing will cause those who don't care to do it and those who opt not to do it. Potentially, perhaps it's more than 2 generations. Mixers matter. They matter because they undermine the current population. Build your gated community. The current population of people are okay with what's happening. Something like that. They undermine themselves. Could be a comedy out of Hollywood. Ken is arguing against a group of people who have no political success and are even less in the public consciousness than they were 3 years ago. Yeah, I'm saying these people suck, so stop following them, okay, and do something different. And yet, we've got thousands of people here. We've got people on my own channel. We've got subscribers. We've got Mr. Coolmug who doesn't quite get it. If everyone was nodding in agreement or saying I'm never going to watch another video, I wouldn't have to have this discussion. But the fact that there are people still watching my videos who disagree with me means I need to push this harder, either to alienate you and get you off the channel, or to convince you. So one of those two things, we need to form a consensus here of what's going on. Stop trying to save people who aren't your friends. I'm either going to save people or I'm going to push them away. But we need to create some bifurcation on this issue. Are you saying that toward me? Invite me to your house, everybody ever. Ethnocentric feelings. You have a couple thousand people you could potentially work with. You don't need a lot of people. Secret organizations. I want nothing to do with the vast majority of people who share my race ethnicity. Probably did not view Africans. I can't read that. We're not going back to tribal identity. You're living in cloud ook land. I think a lot of people who have power have tribal identity. I think if you don't have tribal identity, you're going to die. Rip, no, Ken, it's up to you to provide a convincing alternative. The onus is on you. Yeah, it's called minoritarianism, which is basically a fancy word for tribalism. Secret Discord societies. Who's Mr. Coolmug arguing with? Who's they? Who's the they? They're following them. Brutal. That's it. That's the end of the stream. I gotta go. See you next time. We can make another video if you guys keep supplying comments for me to respond to. And we had 33 viewers, 4 likes, so everybody hates the video, but that's okay. That means it was controversial. That means I'm pushing buttons, which is what I'm supposed to do. Thanks, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.